Listeners, readers, welcome to the Foxed Page, where we dive deep into the very best books. You'll come away with a richer understanding of the text at hand, all while learning to read everything a little better. I'm Kimberly Ford, one-time adjunct professor at Berkeley, best-selling author and PhD in literature. Today, we're putting half of that PhD, it was in Spanish and French literature, we're putting half of it to work with Lie With Me by Philippe Besson. Those of you who've been listening to the Fox Page for a long time know that my brain is particularly happy when it is reading French. I have some thoughts about this that have to do with ancestry. It turns out that I am in Marie Antoinette's maternal haplog group. It also turns out that 1 in every 500 people is. And someone also pointed out the fact that because she did not have any children, I cannot be a direct descendant of Marie Antoinette. And I mean, honestly, I don't really want my claim to the French language to be like this really terrible royal person who did not stand for things that I believe in. But for some reason, my brain is very happy when engaged with the French language. I also love Spanish, and here in California, I have much more opportunity to use my Spanish than my French. Maybe the novelty of French is what makes it so appealing to me. I actually watch a lot of television that is in French, and I certainly end up reading quite a bit. So I was so happy when I saw the name Philippe Besson, and I thought, oh my God, wait, maybe he wrote this originally in French, and I will be able to read it in French. And sure enough, he did. Originally, this book was called Arrête avec tes mensonges, which essentially means stop with your lying. We're going to get to discussion of the title, but I would argue, in fact, that Lie With Me is the much better title. And then I was extra excited because this book is translated by Molly Ringwald. And I have to say that she did a pretty great job. So I know that she had a book that came out. It was like a collection of stories that made a novel. That is not how you describe that kind of literature, but you know what I mean. A novel and stories, I think, is maybe how they sell that kind of thing these days. So I knew that came out and I was like, oh my gosh, apparently Molly Ringwald is kind of a writer, but I did not have any idea at that point that she was translating French. We recently talked about The Mystery Guest by Grégoire Bouillier, and those of you who listened to that lecture know that I was not actually that excited about the second English translation, the one that McNally Jackson put out, but I will say that McNally Jackson really did me right when they put this book on one of their front tables and I saw it and picked it up, and I'm so happy that I did. I'm also going to make a fat generalization here and say that there right now are a whole bunch of covers of novels that are all about love between two men. And these covers are unbelievable. There's just like this, if you're on the YouTube, I'm going to put up a whole spate of them so that you can see what I'm talking about. I mean, they are just the most unbelievable covers. And I'm just going to compare that with this trend that honestly still is just chugging along, where we have, there's a lot of like the big, huge glasses, or there's a lot of bright colors and a lot of color blocking and a lot of all caps font that is very plain. If you're on the YouTube, I'm going to put up some examples of that. As it continues, I just keep looking to these gorgeous books with these gorgeous covers as some kind of relief. So that's a perfect segue, actually, into this question about the fact that many of these stories that I keep reading about young love between young men are these tragic stories. And my sense was like, oh my God, what is happening that all of these stories are so elegiac? That's always in the blurb. It's always, elegiac and heart-wrenching and, really tragic words. And I was very sad about this because it spoke to me about the fact that young love is very difficult among young men. But then I also realized that almost every romance, sort of worth its salt, starting with Romeo and Juliet, really speaks to a lot of tragedy. So I think a lot of young love really does speak to things being very elegiac and things being very complex. And in some ways, these novels about young men in love do speak to the difficulties that are sort of specific to young men falling in love. But it was helpful for me to realize that this idea of tragedy that pervades books like Young Mungo or Call Me By Your Name, that kind of tragedy and that kind of elegiac feel actually is slightly universal when it comes to books about young love in general. So I've now basically covered why it was that I wanted to read this book. Frankly, it was a bit superficial. Loved the cover, loved the title, loved the fact that it would be in French, and loved the fact that it was translated by Molly Ringwald. It was also incredibly popular, and when I dove in, I began to realize, in fact, why so many people are reading this book and why they are enjoying it. Okay, very brief bio of Philippe Besson. And a lot of this, I can tell you, if you have read the novel, a lot of this is going to sound very familiar to you, which is important for many of the things that we are going to discuss today. He was born in 1967 in a town called Barbezieux, which will be, again, familiar. It is the town in which everything in this novel takes place. He was also born the child of a school teacher father. He was, and again, this, as usual, is coming straight from Wikipedia. He was often mocked by schoolmates. That's exactly how they put it in the write-up. And in the final year of high school, he fell in love with someone that Wikipedia describes as a peasant's son. So that to me sounds pejorative and kind of weird and like really straight from like the 17th century. But it does, of course, speak to the fact that in the novel, we have the son of a school teacher falling in love for someone who is of a family that works the land, a family of farmers. In 1999, he was a law graduate student and decided that he wanted to write. He wrote, in fact, the first novel of 23. He's written 23 novels, and I'm so pleased this is the first that I have read because I will definitely be digging into more. The novel of Arrête avec tes mensonges, which is the French version, was published in 2017 and it was adapted in film in 2020. I have not watched it. I'm very excited to watch it. I may get back to you about that, but probably not. So, check it out on your own. Okay, we are now going to dive into the text. So anyone who is here at the Fox page in order to become a better reader, and I'm saying that in quotation marks because I don't really believe, you've heard this before, don't really believe anyone needs to like improve their reading ability, but I really do understand the idea of wanting to get the most out of what you read. And the most basic advice, and the one that I think is most helpful, is to simply pay closer attention. Slow down and take a look at what it is you're actually reading. Part of that is looking at the cover art, with the caveat that most writers have very little control over the cover art. I was so interested. I just spoke about how much I loved the cover of this English translation. But then when I ordered the French version and it arrived, I was so excited because it is a picture that looks like it was perhaps taken in the 80s of a young man sitting down. And of course, you will remember the passage in the book where toward the very end of their relationship, Philippe takes a picture of Thomas. And it's a very moving scene because Philippe is asking for permission, doesn't think he will get it. Lucas, in fact, gives him permission, and he takes a photograph that is a very important vestige of their relationship. I really, really wanted the cover of this to be the actual photo of Lucas. It is not, in fact, a photo of Lucas. Inside, it has the name of the person who took the photograph, and that person is not, in fact, Philippe Besson. So I was a little bit sad about that, but I also really just loved the cover of this. I love everything about this young man who is sitting here. It's really a great cover. And briefly, I will say that in the cover art here on this American version of Lie With Me, I really like how it's difficult to tell exactly what is happening with these limbs here because of the perspective that we have. I like the idea that we're up close because this is a novel that in fact does get up close to a relationship. I like the fact that it's in this kind of black and white and gray tones, which do make it feel sort of elegiac and sort of heartbreaking. And of course, the look on the young man's face is, in fact, heartbreaking, all of which I think is really appropriate and, in fact, very beautiful. I also love the fact that, I don't know if this young man is wearing any clothing, but this speaks to the nudity, which I think is really appropriate and very strong. So I want to move on and talk briefly about the titles. The French Arrête avec tes mensonges is essentially stop with your lying. And I liked the fact that it came up in the French version, which was that his mother used to say stop with your lying because he would tell these extravagant stories. So, of course, telling those extravagant stories is one of the reasons why he becomes a very good novelist later in his life. And I liked this hearkening back to his childhood, and I liked the fact that the title grew organically from the text. But I have to say that it was not a title that struck me in French as being particularly inventive or interesting. And I sort of wondered, I should have checked this out with my literal one French-speaking friend, whether or not this is like a very common phrase that would be, in fact, much more evocative for a French speaker. I did not, in fact, do that. It's not like an idiomatic expression that I know. So I get the sense that it is, in fact, just a mother telling her son to stop with his lies. And I think that is a fine title. I really, though, love the English version. This translation, Lie With Me, is so good in my opinion. So it's very different, obviously. It isn't about stopping. It's not about like shame. It's not about someone putting the brakes on whatever you are endeavoring to do. In fact, it's the opposite. It is an invitation. I love that. I love the intimacy even with the reader. We've talked a lot about this. When there is direct address on the part of any narrator, direct address meaning they are, saying you to a reader, there is a real intimacy. And here we have that intimacy before we've even opened the book. So essentially here we have a narrator speaking to us. We don't know even who it is yet, but this narrator is saying, lie with me, come and lie with me. And there's like a kind of funny biblical thing that happens. Like, I think, they would someone would lay with someone, and it would mean that they were procreating or having children or whatever. Like Ruth lay with Samson or something. I am not a biblical scholar by any stretch. So that probably didn't make any sense to anyone who knows anything about the Bible. But this idea of lie with me does have in my mind some sort of sexual overtones. I also love, of course, the fact that not only does it mean like come and lie down with me, but it also means lie with me as in tell a lie with me. And this is a book that is very, very concerned about lies and being complicit with things, which really is the whole source of the elegiac tone and the whole source of the tragedy that is really at the heart of the book. So very importantly, there's also a subtitle here in the English version, which is a novel. So we have Lie With Me, a novel. And in fact, on the French version, it also says the same. So we have Arrête avec tes mensonges, and then underneath it, roman, which means novel. So in both cases, we have Philippe Besson telling us that he is writing fiction. And later, we are going to have several different instances where Philippe Besson is really insisting on the fact that what he is writing is fiction. But at the same time that he is assuring us that this is fiction, he's giving us lots and lots of opportunity to really believe that this is in fact fact. This book is very autobiographical, and it falls perfectly into this category of autofiction. So autofiction, very briefly, is simply prose that is based in the life of someone who is telling the story. There's lots of it in France. We see it in Norway. They're writing what ends up feeling like either very novelized memoirs or very autobiographical fiction. Okay, we're going to go ahead and open up the book now. We have so many blurbs, which I think is really very well deserved. It's like page after page. I started going through and I'm like, oh my God, when are these blurbs going to end? Lots and lots of praise from a lot of people. And it's about the content. There isn't a lot in there about the translation, although everybody, seems to think that Molly Ringwald has done a very good job. Okay, we get to the title page, and then very importantly, we get to the dedication. So the dedication is simply this: in memory of Thomas Andrieu, 1966 to 2016. So this, of course, was a crusher. This is something that made me so sad right from the beginning. Anytime you have, someone's lifespan written out like that in terms of years, and it's usually in those parentheses, there's a real depth to that. I mean, talk about elegy. There is something very, very sad about looking at the span of a life. And certainly when you do the math here and realize, it actually took me a while, of course, to do the math, but when you realize that this Thomas was only 40 years old when he died, it really heightens our sense of tragedy. And also, this very brief dedication gives us a very important key to the whole entire novel. We're going to find out in the course of this story that the main character, our first-person narrator, is Philippe, which of course allows us to conflate the author, Philippe Besson, with the narrator, Philippe. And very importantly, the object of affection, the object of love on the part of Philippe is Thomas in the book. So this idea of dedicating this book to someone who is a real person, who has real birth date and a real death date, we are definitely assuming here that this is a real person that Philippe is dedicating the book to. And that is very important because, as we talked about, the subtitle is a novel. It's claiming to be fiction. But in fact, here we have an incursion, a foundation of truth. We have this foundation of this real person that is going to inflect our reading of the novel. So a couple of traits of this kind of autofiction are that usually it is a first-person narrator. So it's a story being told, I did this and I did that. Usually the author's name is shared by the protagonist, which is in fact the case here. Philippe Besson is our author, and Philippe is the name of the main character who is telling the story. And then usually in autofiction, you will have a lot of the same biographical data, in this case, the town where this young man was born, the fact that his father is a school teacher, the fact that kids made fun of him when he was young, the fact that he is someone who loves other men. All of those data are the same in real life as they are in the novel itself. So you can look at this either as very sort of novelistic memoir, or you can look at this as autobiographical fiction, either way. So I'm someone who's not like hugely hung up on this, like what is true and what is not true. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that I think a lot of memoir, I mean, you can call it like emotionally true or whatever. I think that's kind of how some people get around it. But I have a hard time believing that a lot of the details that are given in memoir are like very, very true. I do believe that if something is verifiable, and I understand that there is a certain allure in being able to say that something is true, and sometimes autofiction can be a little frustrating, but most of the time I really like the idea of an author really leaning into this idea that often a reader is very tempted to conflate the author and the narrator. Recently, Miranda July did this in All Fours. She made this very interesting point that when a woman is writing a book and there's also a female narrator, people are very quick to conflate those two. And interestingly, she said this happens more with women. But I really liked the idea that we're beginning to see a little more of this autofiction writing that is kind of autofictive here in the United States. Okay, the dedication is in memory of Thomas Andreu. And after this dedication that I think we really can read as, you know, the beginning of the autofiction that we will see in the book, the beginning of this kind of blurring between fact and fiction, we have some epigraphs. We have two, in fact. One is by Marguerite Duras, who wrote The Lover, and the other is Bret Easton Ellis from Lunar Park. We're not going to read both of them. The first is about attraction and desire, and essentially that desire is kind of this instantaneous thing. The second one is about things being final, things being over, and never being able to sort of return, and the finality of the past. So what's most interesting to me is the fact that in the French version, there are 3 epigraphs. We have the same line from The Lover and the same line from Bret Easton Ellis. But in between the two, we have an epigraph from Hervé Guibert, who wrote Fou de Vincent. So this is a writer who comes up in the text, who comes up in the novel, and he's a writer who's actually very formative and very important to Philippe Besson. So I think it's very interesting that they pulled this. And I thought, well, maybe it's something that is so culturally French that like American readers or English readers wouldn't understand. But in fact, it's really interesting. So what it says is this: Il dit, j'avais décidé de ne plus aimer les hommes, mais toi, tu m'as plu. Which essentially means, I'm going to go for a translation, just call me Molly over here. He says, I've decided not to love men anymore, but you have pleased me. So I don't know about the you have pleased me part. Maybe you have given me pleasure. That sounds actually really bad. This is why I'm not, in fact, a translator of French. But I love this idea that like I tried to decide, or I have decided that I will no longer love men, which sounds like not something that people could do, but with an acknowledgement that in fact someone has really brought him a lot of pleasure. And this is such an important epigraph in many ways because it speaks so much to the experience of Thomas in the novel. So I'm a little bit baffled as to why they didn't in fact include this, and I was very happy to read it in the French. So there you go. Now you have all of the epigraphs that are in the French version. Okay, we're going to move on now to the opening of the book. And in some ways, this book has 2 openings. One to the front story, which is this moment when a man who is a novelist, we later learn that his name is Philippe, he is being interviewed and he sees this young man who looks very much like a lover that he has when he was a young man. So that is the front story, and we're going to take a look at the opening of it. One day, I can say precisely when, I know the date, I find myself in the bar of a hotel lobby in a provincial city, sitting in an armchair across from a journalist, a low round table between us, being interviewed for my latest novel, which recently came out. So very interestingly, I can stop there easily. There's sort of this, there's a period, which really marks, a good place to stop. What's interesting to me is that in the translation, the whole entire first section, which is, almost 2 full pages in this American edition, all of that in the French version is 1 long sentence. In Molly Ringwald's version, it is 31 sentences. One of the blurbs I read called this book a fever dream. But I will say that when you read this book in the French, I did read it both in the French and in the English. When you read it in the French, there is a sense of it being more continuous and being more fluid and being sort of a little more like a fever dream than when you have it spliced into these sentences. It's an interesting choice that she has made, and I like it. I think it's fine. I think it works well here, but it is an interesting difference because you don't have that kind of that forward propulsion that you have in the French. So a couple of other really important things about the opening here. We have this first-person narrator, which is really significant. We talk a lot here at the Fox page about narrative stance. It's a very good lens through which to look at a piece of work. And in this case, it is very important because it has a very confessional feel. This is something, it is a secret, in fact, that he is telling us. And it's a really beautiful way. If you can imagine if it were an omniscient narrator, it would have a very, very different feel. But we also have this sense, one day is such a beautiful way to start it. And it really is giving us, very subtly, it's underlining this idea of one day, meaning, both you can imagine that it's one day in the future or one day in the past. There's a specificity to the one day that really speaks to nostalgia. I mean, the length of one day is so brief. And of course, he's talking about an encounter here that's on this one day, this thing happened to me. But somewhere in our subconscious, I really am convinced that we are seeing, these larger ramifications of one day. And then we have data that, in fact, is very much like Philippe Besson. We have this idea that this is a writer. This is someone who is a writer of novels, which again is allowing us to really lean into the idea that this is more fact than fiction in some ways. The other thing that's really important is in the French version, there is the inclusion of one of his recent novels. When the sentence says, "I was being interviewed for my latest novel," then they have the name of the novel in French, and then it says, "which recently came out." So if you are a French reader, and this book is really written, I think, for first and foremost for French people, you would know that novel. And so immediately you would have a sense that this is Philippe Besson talking about himself. It also puts us in time because, in fact, we could look up when that novel came out. This book came out in 2017, so it would have been right around then. We're not going to dig too deeply into this first paragraph, but I think it's really interesting that the narrator includes just a little bit about what is happening in his interview, and we learn that the interview is about separation and the idea of whether or not exile can ever save anyone. And the reason I think those things are interesting, of course, is because this book is about separation. This is a book about two young men who are separated by chance. There's a lot in this book about chance and sort of luck and fate. But I was very interested also in this idea of exile being able to save someone. So one of the reactions that I had, and it was a very strong reaction at the very beginning of the book, is this sense of relief. I was so relieved because presumably, when you are beginning a book and it is told by the first person, you sort of expect to have a lot of sympathy and a lot of understanding for that narrator. A recent exception to that rule was Yellowface, which was so interesting because, in fact, it is not a very likable narrator. And it took me so long to overcome this kind of norm where usually the protagonist, usually the person who is talking the most and who is using the first person, is someone we're supposed to sympathize with. It took me forever to realize, in fact, that she might be a terrible person, which was so naive in some ways. But what happened in this case is I knew that this story was going to be elegiac. I knew it was going to be heartbreaking. And part of me was like, okay, the person who I am sort of going to be most invested in is someone who is intact at the end of the story. And in fact, someone who's doing very well in his life, someone who is a successful writer, he is being interviewed, he sounds very capable, and all of that was very reassuring to me. And this was really key because I was sort of open to the idea of all of the sad things that were going to befall us, in part because I knew that our main guy was going to be okay. So this idea of being very invested in the main character, in our narrator, is the perfect segue into this idea of autofiction. Not only is Philippe Besson inviting us to conflate him with his narrator, but he's also doing some other really interesting things that speak to the complexity of this kind of writing. So I'm going to run through some elements very briefly that are sort of like the biggest hallmarks of autofiction that we are seeing manifest in this book. One is that the name is Philippe, of both the author and the narrator, and Barbezieux is the town where both the author and the narrator are born. We have the school teacher, we have the mockery, we have the falling in love with the peasant's son, and we have this idea that is really underscored right from the beginning that the protagonist of this book is going to grow up to be a successful author. But then, as we move on, some of the things that are most interesting here are things that sort of push against the idea of autofiction and really get to this question of like, what is true and what is truth and what do novels have to do with truth? So on page 45, we have him talking about a time when he learned how to milk a cow and how easy that was for him. He says this: "When I tell the story now of how I happen to possess this skill, no one believes me, convinced that I'm just inventing one of my stories, a drawback of my habit of embellishing." So this was so interesting to me. My marginalia is like all sorts of like stars and asterisks and stuff. This idea of embellishing, I mean, he's telling us right here essentially what his process is, which is that, he has this truth. He does, in fact, know how to milk a cow. And I actually bet that in real life, Philippe Besson knows how to do it. And I'm sure this story, I'm not sure, I have no idea, but you might imagine that it happened like this. But he does admit to a lot of embellishment. And it's one of these things in the beginning, his mom was not very tolerant of these, these stories that he was telling and how, in fact, calling them lies, which is very different than calling them stories. So we really do have this situation in the novel where there is a lot of questioning about what is fact and what is fiction. And this idea here of a drawback of my habit of embellishing really makes embellishing seem like something that is not good, which is interesting in the sense that a novel of autofiction really does rest on embellishment. Okay, we're going to go back to page 9. And here we have our narrator really leaning into this idea of shared biographical data. "I should tell you, I'm the son of a teacher, the school principal. I grew up in a primary school 8 kilometers from Barbezieux in a first-floor apartment that was assigned to us above the village's only schoolroom." So one of the things that's important here and that I noted is this idea of "I should tell you." So he says, "I should tell you," and then colon. So part of this is simply because of the way the plot is going to unfold. He's a very bookish person who is going to leave this town because he has some academic prowess and he wants to go on and, be either a businessman or a lawyer, and then turns out, in fact, to be an author. So this bookishness is very important. So it is a plot point, but also this idea of "I should tell you," and then this biographical data really speaks to this notion of autofiction. And then later in the book, we have this really interesting moment when the idea of autofiction sort of melds with the idea of metafiction. So metafiction is just any time a work is talking about itself. It might be talking about its own structure, which sounds kind of recondite, but it will become clear. So this is the scene when young Lucas is asking Philippe what he is working on. So this is in the front story when the older novelist who's being interviewed sees this young man and realizes that he is the son of the author's former lover. So when the young man asks what he's working on, he at first is hesitant, and then he says this: "I give in and say the story of 2 inseparable friends who ended up being separated by time." He smiles. I urge him not to read anything personal into it. I specify that my books are fiction, that memoir doesn't interest me. So this is so interesting. In part, I just always love something that is meta like this. What I think we are meant to conclude here is that this story about 2 intimate friends who are separated by time is this book. We're meant to think that right now he is working on this book. I'm not sure that's the case. There may be another book that is about 2 friends. But the fact that this is so close to what he ends up writing, I think we are, again, invited to make the leap that he is talking here about these 2 young men. But then we have this moment where he stresses that he is writing fiction, not memoir, and that he's not interested in memoir. And in some ways, I think it's interesting to look at this idea at the end, this memoir doesn't interest me thing, as a way to speak about the limits of memoir, that memoir doesn't interest him, maybe because it's a form that doesn't, it doesn't really hold up. The idea of being able to write about your past with any kind of objectivity is a difficult proposition in some ways. And then we have an even more stunning moment on page 142, especially for readers who have not read all of the work by Philippe Besson. So this is more of the conversation between young Lucas and Philippe about whether or not all of his characters aren't sort of autobiographical. So Philippe is sort of defending this idea that they are not autobiographical. So on 142, it says this: "I say, it's not me who writes to this man, it's a woman, my heroine. He says, 'Who are you trying to convince?' He continues, 'In his brother, the hero is outright called Thomas Andrieu.' which was so interesting to me. I was like, oh gosh, apparently I need to go back and read his brother. It made me so sad that I hadn't already read the book, because it would be so cool if you read his brother and you remembered this person and you remembered this character. And then suddenly there was an entire book, Lie With Me, that was dedicated to who you thought was a fictional character, but in fact is someone who is real, according to the dedication and according to this novel. And if we move on a bit further, this was so moving to me. This is a slightly different angle on this idea of autofiction. So on page 145, I think of all the men I met in bookstores, men who confided in me about having lied for years and years before finally resolving to leave everything to start all over again. They will recognize themselves if they are reading these lines. Thomas never found their courage. So I loved this. So there's a parenthetical. That's why I made this weird little shape with my hand. That parenthetical says, they will recognize themselves if they read these lines. That is something that only works and only has meaning and profundity if, in fact, those people are real people. I mean, we are really moved by this, but the main reason we are moved is because, in fact, we believe there are real men who are reading this book and who will, in fact, see themselves in this parenthetical phrase. So even as, our narrator / author here is protesting and saying, oh no, it's fiction. And oh no, that character was a woman. It couldn't have had autobiographical elements. Even as he is saying all of that, he's also inviting us to read this as something that is in fact factual. He's hoping that these actual men who came to his actual book readings are going to see themselves in the novel. And then on 147, this is the last look at structure we're going to take. This is also the last bit of the conversation between Thomas and Philippe. He is the one who speaks again. What about you? You will write about this story, won't you? You won't be able to stop yourself. I repeat that I never write about my life, that I am a novelist. He smiles. Another one of your lies, right? I smile back at him. Will you allow me to write about it? He shrugs. I have nothing to forbid. So I love this here, of course, because what we have is this idea of asking a sort of permission here, but we also have this really delicious meta thing, which is my favorite one, which is where we realize that they are referring to the book that will become Lie With Me. So you have this conversation that is the beginning and the end of this book, and here at the final part of the book, we are learning essentially about the origins, and we are understanding that this conversation between these men, I think, again, we're invited to believe that it actually happened and that it was the thing that spawned the idea of this actual book that we are holding in our hands. Now that we've discussed autofiction, we're going to move on to talk about the structure of the book. We've already begun our discussion a bit because we've talked about this kind of front story and the back story. The front story being this moment when this author, Philippe, is being interviewed and he sees this young man, Lucas, who looks very much like his father, Thomas. This is a relatively straightforward kind of structure, but Besson does it so beautifully. So, of course, we have on page 1, we have that beginning that we looked at before where he is being interviewed. And then, only a couple of pages later, we have this kind of second beginning. This is the beginning of the backstory. It's the playground of a high school, an asphalt courtyard surrounded by ancient gray stone buildings with big, tall windows. Teenagers with backpacks or school bags at their feet stand around chatting in small groups, the girls with the girls and boys with the boys. If you look carefully, you might spot a supervisor among them, barely older than the rest. So we're not going to dive too deeply, although it is very interesting. It's always so interesting to go back and look at these beginning paragraphs once you've finished a novel. Very clearly, one thing that jumps out is this division, girls with girls and boys with boys, both because you still have this kind of idea that, boys and girls are separated, that they're very different and that they haven't sort of begun to intermingle very much, but also the way that if you were a young gay man, the fact that you would have these kinds of clustering would mean, in fact, here we have boys with boys. It's this idea of young men all being together and having one young man in particular here, Philippe, who is surrounded by people who he might be sexually attracted to. And then when we look on page 18, so this is the beginning of what is called chapter 1, and it's a relatively long chunk of the novel. But what's really cool about it is the backstory. It is mostly the story of these young men in high school. But there are a lot of times where time becomes very fluid, where he is moving toward the future in ways that are really interesting. So we have a lot of commentary about what will happen to him in ways that is very graceful because it expands the story beyond, just the schoolyard and allows us to see this younger person both as he is as a young student, but also as he will be when he is older. So on page 18, we have this. But let's come back to that winter morning in 1984. So it sounds very simple, but this is one of those signposts. It's really well done. Philippe Besson never, the reader always is it's very clear always to the reader, if we're in the front story or the back story. And that is one of the things that allows us very freely to move forward and backward. So an example of that kind of moving forward from, the school days, moving forward into his adult life is on page 70. I didn't know at the time that the writer Hervé Guibert will be an important writer for me. 6 months later, I will discover The Remarkable Adventures, and the passage about the desire to merge with his lover will annihilate me. So, obviously it's also very important here, this idea of desire and the fact that it can be annihilating is obviously very important content. But what's very cool is the fact that that time is very fluid. We are not stuck in the schoolyard days, and it allows the text to feel much richer, because you can imagine that if we were very, very limited, as we might be in memoir, if we were very limited just to the perceptions of Philippe when he is a high schooler, it would be a much different feel. It would be a much more limited book. So then on page 99, we have the beginning of something called Chapter 2, 2007. And I have to say, this crazy thing happened to me. I thought this was the last section. And this section in 2007 is relatively happy. And as things were going along, I just didn't realize that there was going to be a third part and that it was going to be so sad. And on page 99, we have, these very simple signposts that are really very clear to the reader. More than 20 years have passed. So that's the opening paragraph. That's the opening sentence. And then down further, I became a writer. I've come to a bookstore here in Bordeaux for a reading of my latest novel. So this is when I was like, oh, good. And my first thought was like, oh my God, is Thomas going to come to the reading? And then in fact, it is Lucas who comes to the reading. So I was reading the second part thinking this was the ending, and for some reason was really optimistic about how this thing was going to end. I guess I forgot all of the elegiac and heart-wrenching and heart-rending and all of these different things from the blurbs. And then we have, of course, Chapter 3, 2016, which is when we are going to vault over the beginning, the time when the author is being interviewed, and we're going to move further into the future to a time when Lucas, the son, has grown up and has written a letter to our author, Philippe. So on page 125, we have this. A few weeks ago, I received a letter from Lucas, originally addressed to my publishing house, then forwarded to my home. He wrote to me 9 years after our one and only meeting. So the reason I mention this again is it's really, really beautiful the way that Besson is giving us these time frames. He's making things very clear, but it's also doing something else that's much more significant, which is speak to time and the idea of the confusion of time and the idea of things not being able to happen again. When Philippe first sees Lucas, he has this idea that maybe Thomas has somehow sort of come back to life. And when in fact that does not happen, you as the reader are just as crushed. That is not true. We're not anywhere nearly as crushed as Philippe is, but you have this sense of finality. Again, back to Bret Easton Ellis of the Epigraph. So when we have this careful annotating of time, it's been 9 weeks, the letter went here, then it went there. That's also speaking to chance, which is, again, another important theme throughout the whole book. But this emphasis on time and on the passage of time really speaks to the limitation and, again, the sort of tragic nature of this desire. The simple idea that for someone like Thomas, there really was only that very short amount of time when he was really engaging in moments where his desire was satisfied. So we're now going to dive into the idea of translation. I am absolutely fascinated by translation. To me, it seems like such a difficult thing to do because if you're someone who's really digging into language and all of its nuance, you really have a sense that it's difficult to capture the nuance of one language and put it in another. And when people do it well, it's just astounding to me. So one of the things that's kind of an overarching idea here is that a lot of this prose is very kind of stripped down. In the beginning, we have that 1-2-page sentence, that goes on and on and on. But even in that, the punctuation is maybe a little bit tricky, but the syntax, the word choice, a lot of that is fairly straightforward. So there is this idea of this kind of stripped down prose. Philippe Besson speaks to that kind of prose on page 70. Of course, again, we have this idea of this kind of meta moment where he is talking about the book itself. On page 70, we actually have a continuation of this idea of Hervé Guibert, who becomes very important to Philippe. And part of that is because of Guibert's style. So he says, I will discover that these books speak to me and speak for me, and will become aware of the power of literary minimalism, the neutral voice that's closer to reality. So this idea of a neutral voice, I mean, I don't think there is such a thing as neutral voice. And I, for one, am actually happy about that. I love all of the nuance in language, obviously. But this idea of literary minimalism is very descriptive. It really speaks to his prose, which again is very minimalist. It's very sort of stripped down. And it does in some ways feel more neutral. It's sort of devoid of style, which is itself, of course, a style. But that does mean that in some ways I think it's easier for Molly, we're now like on a first name basis, it's easier for Molly to translate because it's not these like incredibly long, convoluted sentences and crazy syntax and crazy word choice, and it's not puns and it's not a lot of internal rhyming. So you have language that's very stripped down. That I think is really, not to say that it's easy, but it also is a real joy for readers because I think you can get a closer translation. You can get a translation, for example, this is going to be easier to translate than, say, Proust or even Flaubert. We have all these different translations of those classics because it's very difficult to preserve the tone and the feeling and all of the nuance of the prose of anyone, but it's much easier when it is stripped down like this. So a couple of other differences. One is that throughout we have also, obviously it's a first-person narrator in the French and in the English, but there's this very big difference that throughout the French version, Philippe Besson is using on. And in French, on, it's the third-person singular, so it's like one does this or one does that, or one was doing this or one was doing that. And it's really a stand-in in many, many ways for the second person, both the second person singular and plural. So both you and we. And for many French speakers, well, for probably all French speakers, that has gotten to be this like very efficient, very effective thing. And it's very, it's something that's just kind of, become ingrained in French literature that you would use on. But what's interesting to me is there is a certain kind of lack of intimacy that certainly as an English reader reading in French, I feel. And I don't actually know, but I have to imagine, at least on like some deep psychological level, that when you have, in English, we really only have like I and you. I mean, we could use one did this and one did that, but I mean, we have that, but it's not something we use. But there is an intimacy of I and you. I mean, there is. It means that, you're having this very dedicated conversation with one other person, the narrator talking directly to the reader. Whereas in the French, it's a little more diffuse. On immediately brings to mind, a group of people. It's not just one person. And in fact, it is a third person thing. So it's not that kind of direct address. So again, for me, these changes were really significant. So in the French, in the very beginning of the backstory, when we are first being introduced to the teenagers, in English, it says things like, it's winter. You can see it in the bare branches of a tree. And in French, it says, on le voit. So like one can see it instead of you can see it. And a little further down, it's the mid-'80s. You can tell from the clothes. And in French, it's ça, on le devine aux vêtements. So you have this idea in English where it's you can see it in the bare branches and you can see it in the clothes. Whereas in the French, it's just a tiny bit more removed because in fact, we are using this third person singular. It's also just simply interesting that Molly Ringwald doesn't have, she's not going to say one could tell it was winter. It would be so weirdly anachronistic. So it is also interesting just to think of the limit in English. It has to be, you can see it in the branches. But I, for one, am a big fan of this idea of a little bit of increased intimacy in the English version. So another noteworthy element of the translation is the verb tenses. So in English, when we talk about the past, we say like, I walked to the store, it rained, and it's kind of this discrete past. It's over and it's done with. It's definitely in the past. In French, there is something called the passé simple, but it's a verb tense that it's kind of fallen out of favor, which is actually great because there are lots of irregulars and it was very difficult to learn. You'll still see a lot of it in classic literature, but it's really not used anymore. What is used instead is the passé composé, which is like, I have done this and I have done that. And again, this is one of those conventions that has gotten to be so ingrained in French speakers and in fact in French writing as well, that that I don't think French people are, I don't think that they are feeling this as like, as a past that is continuous with the present. I think they really are feeling it as a past thing. But there is a very subtle difference because of the finality in English versus this kind of ongoing past in French. So on page 22, there are lots of examples of this, but it says, Du reste, j'ai grandi dans une école primaire. So j'ai grandi means I have grown up, but in English you would say I grew up. It's over and done with. He's grown up. But this j'ai grandi is like I have grown up. Later there's an example, Mon père a été mon maître. So my father was my teacher. In English, that would be, my father was my teacher. It's over and done with. It's in the past. It's in the preterite. Here, a été has been my teacher. So there is this very subtle way that in French, strictly grammatically, the past and the present are like a little more fluid, a little more stuck together than in the English, where the past is very final and very discreetly over in the past tense. So a lot of the book is told in the present, which is really interesting because you have this very beautiful kind of mix of past and present both. But it was so interesting to me to read it and just really kind of sink into this difference. Again, this is a subtlety that as an English speaker reading the French, it's very interesting because it does feel really different. And I think for most French speakers, it just feels like the past tense. But this is one of those things, I'm really an advocate of this idea of our reality and our sense of things, even like time, as being inflected by our language. So I do think this idea of like, I grew up versus I have grown up. In English, those are very different things. But I do think there is a slightly different sense that may or may not, prove important in how we are conceptualizing these large things, the translation. The last thing I will say, there were several omissions throughout, things where Molly Ringwald just left out chunks of the text. And most of them were very logical. There were things, maybe you leave out the title of that novel that he refers to because most English readers don't know it. It's the beginning of the book. You don't want to sort of throw in this title that really isn't all that relevant for an audience that won't know it very well. They were things like that. There was one where she was where Philippe Besson is talking about acid wash jeans, and the description in French is a little bit belabored. It's a little bit long. We have a very specific term for that. Acid wash tells you all you need to know about the jeans. So most of the times when I saw things that were kind of left out of the English version, I thought that, there was a very good reason. It does feel even more spare in the English version, and part of that is the punctuation, because throughout, Molly Ringwald is making much shorter sentences that really work well with this really stripped down prose, whereas we have a little more fluidity in the French version. So it feels a little richer and a little fuller. It's also so weird because the French version is just like physically so much longer than the English version. I'm having a hard time getting these straight so you can see them on the YouTube. They're just very, very different books. One is very little and the other is not little, which I found very interesting. And before we move away from translation, one very cool thing is simply that the beginning of L'Amant by Marguerite Duras, which is the book that is cited at the beginning, there's an epigraph from this, it also begins un jour, which, that might be one of these like conventions, like one day. It is kind of, that's an English thing too, like one day, blah, blah, blah. It is not the same as Once Upon a Time. That is Il était une fois. So I had to think about that. I was like, wait, maybe this is like a very well-trod convention. And I don't think it's quite that. But I really liked the fact that L'Amant and the Philippe Besson novel both begin with those same two words, un jour, and then they, depart radically from one another. But not that radically. It really, you know what? I'm going to have to reread this. Stay tuned, people, for a lecture on this incredible book. The last thing we're going to do before we close is talk about desire and sex writing in the novel. I think Besson does such a good job with this. I want to underscore the idea that in many ways, this first-person narrator, when we get to the very end of the book, I felt that same kind of relief that I did in the beginning. I felt terrible for Thomas in many, many ways. It is an absolutely tragic book, but I think part of me was like waiting for something that was going to be just devastating, and it was. But I also had this feeling, because our protagonist was someone who was self-aware and someone who had processed a lot of his ambivalence and a lot of his experience, and someone who was self-assured, and someone who was successful, and someone who was kind of living out his dreams, and someone who had, partners who were important to him, someone who seems to be happy in relationships. It was so important to me. It was kind of like a victory, and it added this really nice sense of optimism and gravitas. It was such a nice balance, and I really liked that idea. This came full circle for me when I was like, wait, what's with all of these stories of tragedy in the stories of young men in love? And then I was thinking, well, all of these stories are tragic. And this one it's very tragic. I mean, it's really horrible, but there also is a certain amount of optimism because, in fact, we have a very good example of someone whose desire was confusing and difficult for him when he was young, and yet is someone who seems to be really doing well in the world. So I loved, though, what he has to say directly about desire. So on page 17, this is the very beginning of the novel, when we first are realizing, how much this young Philippe desires this young man, Thomas, who is really separated from him by all sorts of social conventions. So on 17, it says this: "To him, I'm a stranger. I'm in this state of one-way desire. I feel this desire swarming in my belly and running up my spine. But I have to constantly contain it and compress it so that it doesn't betray me in front of others. Because I've already understood that desire is visible. Momentum, too, I can feel it. I sense a movement, a trajectory, something that will bring me to him. This feeling of love, it transports me. It makes me happy. At the same time, it consumes me and makes me miserable, the way all impossible loves are miserable. I am acutely aware of the impossibility." So we do, from the very beginning, have, the tragedy is inherent. He is telling us right here, this is an impossible love. But I love the way that he is talking about desire. So I'm generally not a huge fan of people talking about, the way something feels in their body in writing. It gets very close to cliches like, my blood ran cold. But the idea of a feeling in your tummy or, whatever that is. So this idea, I feel this desire swarming in my belly and running up my spine. I did not love that. It was fine, but I was happy to move away from it. And it really, I think it's a decent description of that kind of fluttery feeling that you do get in your stomach. I mean, poor writers, I don't know what you people are supposed to do with it, but, don't say that fluttery feeling in your tummy. What I like better is things like desire is visible. I mean, we know what he's getting at there. And then a little further, this feeling of love, it transports me, it makes me happy, it consumes me and makes me miserable. I mean, it's really a beautiful, kind of meditation on desire and young love and, in fact, impossible love. Okay, if we move on to page 22, as I approach, I see his nervousness, see that it's actually just shyness. I wonder if he feels shame. I want to believe that it's only embarrassment, a question of modesty. I remember also that he's reserved in a way that sets him apart. I could be put off, but instead it moves me. Nothing touches me more than cracks in the armor of the person who reveals them. So I love this. It was very important, the idea of shame, and I was very happy that he sort of tests it, whether or not it is shame, and then moves on to other things like, this is someone who's also just reserved, and this is someone who is shy. So I like the idea that there may not, in fact, be shame. But then even more moving to me was this idea about vulnerability as being really desired, as something that can be desired, and that's something that is desired, in fact, in this case. So there's an adage that if you want your readers to like your characters, you should show them all of your characters' weaknesses. And that is a very human thing. When we hear about someone's weaknesses, there should be a lot of sympathy generated, and we should invest in them more. And so I really liked the sort of manifestation of that in real life here. I mean, real life, it's in a novel, but it is also a novel that is describing, a very real phenomenon, which is this idea of falling in love, and particularly of young love. Okay, if we move on to page 64, this is our last look at desire. And this is something on 64. I mean, I love this even more than I have loved the other statements, in part because it does speak to this optimism. That idea, that campaign for a long time about how it gets better. There is a real sense of optimism here that is very closely tied to desire. So on 64, we have this. I've changed, aged somehow. I'm no longer a neurotic, frightened, easily insulted boy, but rather a boy who's thinking, who's been awakened. It's something that comes from using the body, from stirring up desire, sharing oneself with another, finding victory over a kind of solitude. So I love this because, again, because this is something that is happening for this adolescent as an adolescent. This has to do with desire. It has to do with sexual awakening. And I really love the positivity here, this idea that that Thomas might not be able to be transformed in this way, which is really obviously the tragedy of the story, but that in this case for Philippe, it really is transformational, the desire and in fact the consummation of that desire. I think it is just so beautifully done. So I mentioned before that there's not a ton of sex writing in the book, but I really found it so beautifully done. It was like the perfect way to write about sex. Many of you heard this time and time again, but I had a writing teacher who said the best way to write about sex is just describe what is happening, not to use metaphor. And that is exactly what Philippe Besson is doing, and he's doing it so well. So on page 30, we have this. Love, its mouths that seek, lips that bite, drawing a little blood. His stubble irritates my chin, his hands grab my jaw so that I can't escape. It's the coarseness of his hair where I slide my fingers, the tautness of his neck. My arms close around him, encircling him to be as close as possible so that there is no space between us. It's torsos that join together and then withdraw in a hurry to remove clothing, the Nordic sweater, the t-shirt, so that it is finally skin next to skin. His torso is muscular and hairless, with nipples that are flat and dark. My chest is skinny, not yet deformed as it will be 4 years later by the blows of an emergency room doctor. That, I was like, wait, why do we have that in the middle? I mean, it's very interesting to think about in the middle of this sexual experience, this sexual awakening, that you have this very sort of violent thing that is going to happen, which, I mean, maybe that's the point of this kind of incursion, but I found it actually like a little out of place. But moving on. It's skin that is frantically caressed. My fingers find constellations of moles just as I guessed on his back. It's jeans that we unbutton. I discover his sex, veiny, white, sumptuous. I'm enthralled by his sex. It will take many years and many lovers before I ever return to this sense of amazement. So this is, I'm not going to read much more. There are only a couple more paragraphs, but I don't need to get too intimate with everybody. But this is such a good example of simply describing what is happening and how powerful that can be. And it's obvious, it seems very obvious, but if you are writing a book about sexual awakening, it's extremely important to be able to write well about sex. So I think that's one of the reasons why this book does so well and why it works so well is because the sex writing is so good. So we aren't going to talk long about the ending, and we're not going to read it. It's a really very powerful ending. And what it is, and I think it's very beautifully structured, is that young Lucas has found a letter from his father, and it is clearly for Philippe, and it turns out to be a letter that Thomas wrote way back in 1984. And it's really beautiful that we end with the letter, we end with Thomas's words, and he is someone who doesn't get a lot of airtime. He's not doing a lot of speaking throughout this novel, so it's really cool that we have his words at the end, and that Philippe Besson just leaves it at that. He doesn't have any kind of response. He doesn't finish it. He really lets this letter stand, which is so beautiful. And of course, the ending of the letter is one of the most tragic parts in the book, is that he knows he will never be this happy again. So this is something that he wrote when he was a young person. He was 16, 17 years old. And that really is a very deep tragedy. And it really is the part of the book that is absolutely heartrending. So I loved the fact that that was the note that we ended on, and it really gave some gravitas and some real weight and really a very tragic kind of beauty to the whole thing. But I'm going to end on the slightly more optimistic note. You can tell I'm really leaning into a slightly more positive look at this book, which is that we do have a sense that our narrator and even the son, Lucas, are going to go on and live their lives. And yes, you have this idea that maybe young male love is easier today in terms of, being public about it and feeling shame and internalized homophobia, that all of that stuff is maybe a little better than it used to be. But it's also really heartwarming and really good to think that there is, there was a young French person in Thomas's exact era, in his exact tiny town in France, and he was someone who was able to feel empowered about his desire, even as a younger person, and that he is someone who has gone on to have a life that seems like it is very full of partnership and desire and romance and sex. So I'm going to just leave it on that optimistic note. I want to thank you so much for tuning in, and I hope that this has been informative and inspirational. And I just want to say, really good job. Molly Ringwald, man, she just really did a great job. And I really, really loved this book, the first that I have read by Philippe Besson. So thanks for tuning in. Happy reading.